I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, ROM. Today, it's part 7 of our 10-part series, decade by decade, looking at the greatest writers of the 20th century in Chinese literature.
We really need a theme song.
We do? Why don't you write it? Rob, you're a musician.
I don't have time, dude. I'm working on a dissertation. Come on.
No,
I don't have time to write a theme song.
Are you asleep from the hours of like 9 p.m. to the hours of like 6 a.m.?
On a good day, yes. Well, not 9. More like 10 to 6. This morning was 5:15, but that's the life when you have kids. You know. Oh, we should also mention here, we're recording in a church space
where we normally record. Your church has generously allowed us to record in
my wife
space.
and I tend to work here because there's nobody here, and the church was like, "Yeah, sure, use this empty room." But it also means Lee and I can record in person and still be socially distanced. Anyway, so you may hear sounds in the background because today, unlike most other days, my kids are playing at church.
So those screams aren't child sacrifice?
Or aren't? We stopped that a good couple of months ago. No more child sacrifice.
Y'all are no longer a truly Abrahamic religion.
No,
You're just Abrahamic in the sort of symbolic sense.
We're Lutherans, dude. Come on. Keep up. Yes, we're in the 1960s, Lee. 1960s are rough, man.
Well, for you.
Why?
Because, I mean, you're only knowledgeable about writers from the PRC, whereas I have embraced a wider view of Chinese literature.
We'll get into that. You know, one of the things I should mention that has been hard about the every decade of the 20th century thing is what do we do with the Maoist era? Because the 50s, which was our last one in this series, was a little easier because there's still an effort to produce what we might think of as actual literature, serious literature.
It's not
right?
good, but it's not
great, but
it's still literature.
It's still recognizable. The 60s and 70s are a self-conscious attempt to get rid of anything smacking of quote-unquote art with a capital A, and the 60s doesn't really even produce any novelists of any note. I mean, they just weed the whole genre out.
In order to keep our family safe title in iTunes, we can't really say how we feel about the 1960s and 1970s. Tough. So, Rob, you mentioned the Maoist period. We're looking at the period from that's really referring to the period from 1949 to 1976, 1978.
That's roughly when it's usually dated. Yeah, 1976.
I mean, the ending is kind of a question mark on where that actually ends, but this is the period when China is undergoing some pretty horrific stuff politically. I mean, I think the listener probably knows.
So we have the Great Leap Forward in the 50s. It ends in the early 60s. Mass deaths, not usually, but due in large part to starvation from government-mandated quotas.
This is kind of comparable to the Ukrainian starvation.
Yeah. The 60s, once again, there's kind of a cooling off period. Let's rethink this.
1961 through 1965, 66.
66 is the beginning of the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution.
This is when Mao stages a comeback and tries to retake power. He'd kind of been pushed out in the late 1950s out of power, and he's kind of just hanging out, writing, doing other things.
And the Cultural Revolution, and we don't need to give the entire history. This is, again, something you can easily Wikipedia if you want. But the gist of it, though, is that because Mao's been pushed out of power, he goes, well, I'm not going to get any help from within the party. I'm going to have to look outside the party, which he does. And he effectively calls on the youth of the nation to purge the party's ranks of capitalist roaders, infiltrators.
That's another way of saying Mao loses power, and despite the fact of still having some power, he essentially starts a civil war against his own government.
Yes, very much so. And so the quote-unquote Red Guards that spring up around him are college-age kids, some younger than that, who are called upon to call out their teachers, anyone who seems to be not towing the party line, and make them confess their crimes.
This is the period where in Guangxi in southern China, some people took this so far that they found there were instances of cannibalism. I think maybe 138 instances of documented cannibalism in Guangxi, where people would eat people who weren't leftist enough, and particularly a group of middle school students ate their teacher for not being leftist enough.
And to counter that, it's a peculiar period, too, where not everywhere was touched equally. When I was living in Shandong province, one of my early writing dreams was to interview my neighbor, who was in his 70s at the time, his old retired professor, and get the real story, quote unquote, of the Cultural Revolution from him. And so I was like, so, tell me, what was it like? And he was like, I don't know, like, nothing much happened here. I mean, like, some people marched and all that, but we kept going to class and stuff. So it was a really weird period where you had everything from cannibalism to riots in the streets to crickets chirping, nothing. Like, it's very strange. But what it did mean was that if you were looking for art, you weren't going to find it anywhere. And I don't mean that in the aesthetic sense, like bad art. I mean any art whatsoever. I did a little research in this. I was going to try to find a writer. Okay, what's a great communist novelist from this era who could really define? There isn't one, right? I mean, it's all gone, right? From the 60s until the mid 70s, really. Until you either go until you kind of cross the Straits to Taiwan, which you're going to do, or you go underground, which is what I'm going to do. So you want to introduce your person?
Yeah, so my writer from the 1960s for Chinese literature is Bai Xianyong. He is a sort of Taiwanese writer, and I say sort of very carefully. He was born in actually Guangxi, which we were talking about, where the cannibalism occurred. His father was a very important general who worked for Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi. This is Bai Chongxi, I think, is his father's name. And he was a part of the KMT, the group that kind of led China from 1925 really to 1949, on and off. And he was the general was very important. Like the U.S. was in negotiations with Bai Xianyong's father. Bai Xianyong is interesting because he was born Muslim like his father. He attended Catholic school, and he eventually wound up in the U.S. teaching, I believe, at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and sort of became a Buddhist. So he's kind of religiously been around the place. Bai Xianyong in the 1960s starts publishing a series of stories that are kind of, they eventually became a collection. I think the collection was published in 1971, but he starts publishing the series in the 1960s, and it's the collection eventually became called Taipei Ren, or just the people of Taipei, or Taipei people, something like that. And it's this fascinating collection of short stories of a very historically informed writer, a writer who's trying to kind of who's looking back from 1960 and actively thinking about the 1920s and the 1910s and what's going on in that period and the kind of revolution that happened and all of the revolutionary fervor of that period, and kind of sort of being nostalgic for it, or like it's a very historically informed nostalgia. I'm thinking particularly of Dongye, one of the stories in that series, Taipei Ren, where you have a guy who is a professor at an American university, much like Bai Xianyong. So I think you can say it's kind of an autobiographical story to a certain degree. But this professor is trying to teach his kids about China. He's in the classroom teaching about China. And his kids are like, oh, this is the 1960s. We just want to like have revolution or whatever. And so he starts framing what happened in 1919 with the May 4th revolution in terms of the revolution going on amongst students in the 1960s. And he's like, the Chinese students were there. We have several thousand years of student revolution.
Yeah, this is nothing new.
Yeah, essentially. And I'm kind of like making fun of it, but it's a really good story, and the whole collection of stories, which I believe it's been translated into English actually, is quite fascinating in terms of how it deals with history. Interestingly, it's called Taipei Ren, so the people of Taipei, but it's entirely people who weren't from Taipei.
Right, but that's one of the peculiar things about Taiwanese literature in general is this rather fraught relationship with mainland China. You mentioned nostalgia. A lot of the people who had crossed over in Taiwan, who would have been writing in this period, for example, do have these memories of 1919 and shortly after, when wow, things are getting better. We're changing things, and all of a sudden, oh wait, no, we're not. Now we're fleeing. How did this happen?
Just for the listener who's not aware, Taiwan was a Japanese colony until 1945. And then the Chinese government, run by the KMT, takes it over in 1945, and then the KMT loses the civil war with the communists in mainland China, and so many people in the KMT have to flee to China. So Bai Xianyong is one of those people who flees.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the characters that he deals with in this series of stories are people who had
exiles almost.
Flee. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's almost kind of Joycean nature of Taipei Ren in this collection of stories, which makes it fascinating.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because you have so much of what we're used to seeing in sort of quote modern Chinese literature, May 4th movement, et cetera, but from the outside almost, and I don't know if you can hear crying in the background. There are children crying. I guarantee they're not crying about the situation of exiles in Taipei, although they should be.
Your kids might, actually.
They might. They may know enough about that by now, Anyway. But yeah, it is a fascinating collection and really interesting, in some ways, the best sort of emotional lens onto this era, because these are people all over China who remember well before Mao came to power. It wasn't like it was a garden spot before Mao came to power, but still, there are people who remember times that were peaceful, times that were good. And so there's a lot of things in common between those still struggling under the Maoist regime in China and those who made it to Taiwan. There's an emotional resonance there.
And that's something that increasingly is disappearing in Taiwan. I should just point out that my writer from the 1960s and the writer that I'm going to choose for the 1970s are both from Taiwan. And I think you could say that part of the reason for that is because Chinese literature is such dog poop. Mainland Chinese literature is such dog poop during this period. But I also would argue that Taiwanese literature sees this real flowering in the 1960s and particularly the 1970s. You have lots of Taiwanese writers who are incredibly good writers, and even if the stuff that was happening in mainland China wasn't dog poop, I would still probably end up choosing Bai Xianyong and the writer that I'm going to choose for the 1970s.
Although I have to throw in here, that's because you're not looking underground. I mentioned underground earlier. The 1960s in China is also when you start having the first real strong underground literary movements, particularly poetry. So the writer I'm choosing is Shi, relatively unknown, frankly, even now, unless you're in China. If you're in China and you're at a university, you likely have read Shi. Shi started writing poetry. He's, again, like a lot of writers from that era in China, he did his time in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. But his poetry does not read like Maoist poetry. It's very, very different. He takes some of the same sort of tropes. I'm thinking of one sequence, very early sequence from the mid-'60s, when he's talking about the sea, which is often just likened to the people in Maoist sort of propaganda and rhetoric. The ship of state is carried on the people, etc. Kind of very boring comparison, frankly. But Shi turns it inside out and talks about storms on the sea and talks about, it's a very strange piece. You read it and you go, wait, what is he talking about? Just saying, what is he talking about is extremely powerful, because in the 60s, you never asked that question. If you were a published writer, it was clear what you were talking about.
We should point out that writing under communism, you had to be very apparent,
crystal clear.
there was a kind of understanding of literature that I think Mao himself articulated. Mao says, I think in his writings on Yan'an, his talks from Yan'an, says that literature is supposed to be clear enough so that the workers and peasants can understand it. And if it's not, then it's doo-doo. And so for someone to be kind of like, I'm going to be like
opaque
and symbolic. That's actually like a huge literary statement, and it could get you thrown in jail.
Yeah, and he's still really the spearhead of a movement that will later become called Misty poetry, which is what I'll talk about in the next decade, in the 70s. But he's really one of the first major poets to actually start composing verse that a Western reader who's read, say, T.S. Eliot or even Emily Dickinson will understand as quote-unquote poetry with a capital P.
Is he influenced by Eliot or Dickinson?
I'd have to go back and look at my notes on that, because I know when I was in China studying at Nankai, that was a discussion about Shizhi. What were his influences? Obviously, it was awfully hard to get copies of people like T.S. Eliot in Maoist China, so he may have just been drawing off of a much older Chinese tradition, because there's a lot of very opaque, strange stuff in the Chinese tradition. But he's adopting some of the same sort of modern sensibility. There's no real rhymed verse. There's no regular character patterns in the lines. But you will reach the end of some of his poems and really not know where you're at, which was on purpose. I'll talk a little more about that when we get to the next decade. But I should point out, one of the things that's fascinating about Shizhi, and especially later poets from other decades, is that he's someone who did what you're supposed to do as a good young communist, right? Serve in the PLA, serve the people, et cetera, and still go, and he still looked around and went, yeah, no, this is not working. Something's not working. This is not someone who rebelled against the system and went and hid in a cave and wrote poetry. This is someone who served in the military and then still is writing this stuff. He's a soldier, a PLA soldier, effectively writing against the regime, so not necessarily publishing. None of these poems that you read in the 60s came out in any kind of collection in the 60s, because it wouldn't have been published.
So he's still a PLA soldier
I think by the time he writes poetry, he's out of the PLA.
Okay.
Discharged, I believe, because he was wounded. I could be wrong about that. Anyway. But I know he wasn't in the PLA when he wrote these.
And so, I mean, he's writing these and just kind of stuffing them under his mattress. They're not published.
Definitely not published.
When do they get published?
They're published later, after the one of the poets I'll be talking about next decade begins getting some notoriety, especially international notoriety. Then people begin looking back going, hey, wait a minute. Look at these poems this guy's been writing. They're really similar, but he wrote like 10 years earlier. They're not as mature. I should point this out. So the Chinese poet from the late 70s that everyone tends to know is Bai Dao, who was an absolutely fascinating writer. But his poetry definitely reads like what we would think of as contemporary sort of modern poetry. Shizhi is a bridge. It still feels somewhat simplistic in places, like he's trying to use the same sort of Maoist style, but in a slightly different way. Like, I'm going to use what Mao's doing and encouraging people to do, but against Mao, right? At times it feels like that. It's not necessarily the very experimental avant-garde stuff that would come in the late 70s.
So, Rob, you've talked previously about how you don't like how everything, when Westerners are discussing China, everything that's good artistically has to be dissident literature.
Right.
Does this qualify as dissident literature?
That's going to be a question for the 70s, because
let's ask it now.
Let's ask it now. Well, what's dissident about it, the first time I picked up a collection of this kind of stuff, I was in my early 20s, which is often a period where you're like, yeah, let's be revolutionary, let's be rebellious, let's find out what's out there, And I read it and thought, I don't get why this is dissident. There's no, down with the system sort of stuff. This isn't Rage Against the Machine, especially because Shizhi never had a record contract that we know of. But what it is...
He was a committed Marxist.
He wasn't like Zach De La Roca or anybody else. But really what's dissident about it is a refusal to compose something simple or simplistic. Now, in the 70s, this gets more serious with writers going, everyone in the Maoist era is supposed to read as a group. We're all supposed to have the same thoughts, the same feelings. That's the whole point of this stuff. There's no possibility of interpreting it differently, but we want people to be able to read as individuals. The only way that's going to happen is if a lot of our poetry is a little resistant, challenging, right? You give someone a poem and not everyone's going to read it the same way, right? That means that when you're reading it like you. You interpret it as you interpret it, right? That's the conscious effort in the 70s. And that's what Schurger starts, is to go, yeah, I get that, the ocean is supposed to be the people, right? But what does that actually mean, right? How does that work? What if we muddied the waters a bit? And because, I am the people. I don't feel like that. And so he writes poetry kind of muddying the waters, as I said, making it not simple, making it complicated, making the people be more than just this big mass that's supposed to follow the party. It's composed of, people.
Rob, is there a translation of Shizhi that the listener who doesn't speak Chinese should be looking at?
That's a good question, and I don't think so. I have never seen one. That does not mean that there isn't one. As I mentioned, this is kind of a transitional poet. This is not someone with the kind of international renown that Beidao would have over the next couple of decades. This is someone, the missing link between the Maoist stuff and the new stuff.
So
right?
He's like Cro-Magnon man.
He's the Cro-Magnon man of Chinese modern. Yeah, exactly. Hey, it'd be fun to translate him though. That'd be interesting stuff.
Future work.
Future project. Yes, exactly. Yeah, but Lee, you asked me about translations of Shizhi. Are there English translations of Bai Xianyong that people could pick up?
Yes. It's just called, I think, Taipei People.
Okay, Taipei People. That's an easy one to remember. People from Taipei, Taipei People. I've read Bai Xianyong as well. He is very, very interesting. If you can't find any translations of Shizhi, you never know. One of us might be able to provide you with one someday.
Eventually.
Hint, hint to all publishers.
I think that's a great place to leave it, Rob.
We'll see you in the 1970s with yet more not above ground writers.
And I'll be bringing another Taiwanese writer. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.